Hi guys, thanks so much for joining in on our online sewing workshop for the Fawn Dress Set. I am Ali from Common Stitch and I will be taking you through today how to sew the fawn dress. So this sew along goes with our pattern, the Fawn Dress Set. So we've got two different size ranges, 6 to 14 and 16 to 22. This is Australian sizing. We have got paper patterns, but we've also got the digital version available online through our website, so you can download that anywhere in the world. You can print it out on AO sheets at a copy shop or A4 paper or US letter paper if you want to print at home. So this dress comes with two different bodice styles. So we've got view A and view B with the style with the sleeves, and then we've got view C and D, which has got no sleeves. So then we'd use the binding around the armholes there. So I'll be taking you through how to do both bodice styles and then attaching them to the skirt. So like I said, this is view A and view B, and we've got the short length, so that's view A, and then we've got the bodice style for view C and D. I'll also be showing you how to make this into a top if you decide to do that. Nice, easy, hackable pattern. So enjoy. Thank you for joining in. Some of the tools that you are required for this sew along is your sewing machine, of course, thread and matching bobbin. I always love to keep a second bobbin filled with thread on the top of my machine while sewing, because your bobbin will always run out. It means you can just quickly replace it and continue going. Pins or pattern weights, scissors. I've got two different types here. I've got my general scissors for cutting out fabric, and then I've got just a little pair of snips I keep next to my sewing machine, easy to cut off threads and things like that. Measuring tape, quick unpick, marker's chalk, mine's been well used, and some sew-in labels if you decide to pop any. We are going to be using the Kylie and the Machine labels. We've got a couple of different styles that we're using, and we will show you those at the end when we do some finishing little touches to it. So please enjoy, and thank you very much. So when the pattern instructions say fold it selvage to selvage, this is what they're talking about. So this is the selvage of the fabric. It will be on both sides, but this is just a smaller piece I've cut, so it's only on the one. So what we want to do is fold it so the two edges are meeting up, and then we've got our fold side here. So there are a few ways you can do your pattern pieces. You can either cut out your direct size from your pattern, you can trace them using just like a standard butter paper. You can even use baking paper if you just make sure you get the non-grease proof one. That way your pen will actually be able to stick to it. Or you can use a tracing wheel, which we've got a little tutorial on our website of how to use a tracing wheel as well. So when you've got your pattern pieces, these ones are just miniature, that's why they look so small in my hands. It'll have on if patterns need to go along the fold, and it will also have the grain line. So with this particular pattern piece, it's the front bodice, and we need to put this edge along the fold so that you don't have a seam at the very front of your top. So with that, we would just pop it along the seam on the fold and pop a couple of pins in it. So all of our patterns have got a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which is already included in our pattern pieces. So you don't need to add anything as you're going. You can just cut out your correct size and away you go. So there we go, we've got one pattern piece down. What I've done here is I've cut out all the pattern pieces for both bodices A and B that we'll be showing you today. So this one is for the back, and you can see that it doesn't have to be on the fold because we do have a center back seam. It can be cut into two different pieces. So that's something we could place here. And then we've got the same for the other two bodices. So you just pin those all in place. You can also use pattern weights to keep them down, which is sometimes a lot easier than having to pin them in place. Then we've got the sleeve, which also has its grain line through it. So you just want to make sure the grain line is matching up with the grain line of your fabric. So if you've got the selvage edges folded over to meet each other, then that will be the grain of where your fabric is going. And then we've got the skirt piece, which also needs to be on the fold. So I've pinned down my pattern pieces and I've made sure to get the correct amount. If it says cut 1 or cut 2 or cut a pair, most of the time all our patterns are cut with the fabric folded over it, so you're cutting 2. And when it says cut a pair, you just want to make sure that your fabric is all running the same way. So if you've got, this is a plain linen, but if you've got a bit of a pattern linen
something with a stripe through it, you want to make sure that they're all going the same way and that you've got a right side and a left side for everything. So when it says cut on the fold, and if you may not have enough fabric, you have to cut it into 2 pieces or add a seam in, just make sure that all your fabric is going the correct way. So we've got them all pinned down now. Now they can all be cut out. So when we cut out our bias binding, we're going to cut it on the 45-degree angle. So normally everything else we've been cutting has been along the grain line. You can see it's nice and firm. And when you cut everything on the 45-degree angle, you can see it has a lot more stretch to it. So these bias binding parts are going to go around the neckline and around underneath the sleeves for view C and D. So we want it to be able to pull nice and tight when it's going around all the curves. It will just sit a little bit flusher when you're wearing it later. So we lay our pattern pieces out on the 45-degree, and then just like that, give them a cut so it doesn't need to be on the fold or anything like that, and just follow the cutting instructions that are in the instruction booklet. So now all the pattern pieces have been cut out. Make sure that you protect the surface that you're cutting on, whether that's with a cutting mat, a towel, another piece of scrap fabric. Just make sure that you don't scratch the surface that you're working on. You can also use something like an erasable pen or a pair of snips to make sure that you're cutting any little notches, if there's any back sleeves, noting where they are. You can also leave the pattern pieces pinned onto the pieces of fabric until you're ready to sew with them, so you don't get things mixed up like the back bodice and the front bodice. So we've got all our pattern pieces cut out. So you can tell with things like the front of the bodice that we cut on the fold. When we take it apart from the pattern piece, that it's kind of like your one piece of top because there's no seam, whereas where we've got the back bodice here, we've got 2 pieces, and that's because we're going to do a centre back seam as a bit of a design detail, which we'll show you in the future steps. So now you've got all your pattern pieces cut out. Make sure you don't lose any, pop them in an envelope to use later if you're going to make it again, and on to the next step. So throughout the entire sewing, we use 2 different finishing methods after we've sewn our seams. So the first one is to overlock, so we've got the simple 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then we've got the overlock between our 2 pieces. So that just makes sure that it's nice and all tidied up. It's not going to fray in the wash or anything like that. If you don't have an overlocker, which is totally fine, you can still sew all these garments without one. But if you are sewing in linen, it does fray a lot, so we do recommend that you zigzag stitch. So once you've done your seam as per the instructions, you just turn your machine over to the zigzag stitch and sew along that edge. So it's like that, and then when you fold it out, it's all neat and tidy. It means that when the fabric frays and it gets to these points, it won't kind of go past these points, and because it's in a zigzag format, it gets really confused because it does like to fray in a straight line, so it will just stop it fraying when it goes through the wash. So step 2 is to sew the centre back seam of the back piece. So we've just pinned it here, and then we're just going to sew the seam with the 1 centimetre seam allowance. Always making sure to back tack at the beginning and the end. That we've got our 1 centimetre seam done at the back, we are going to finish the seam with either the zigzag stitch or your overlocker, and then press it open. So when you're pressing it open, just make sure you press it over to the one side and make sure the top and the bottom of both have got that side pressed down. So now that we've got that centre back seam done, it's been overlocked and it's been ironed to one side, so it's the same at the top and the bottom, all ironed over to the one way. We're going to do a top stitch. That means we're just going to stitch along the very top, nice and close. You can still do your 1 centimetre seam allowance over to the edge, and just running it all the way down. It's just a nice little design detail. Again, always making sure to back tack at the beginning and at the end so that it doesn't come undone. So we've got a nice top stitch centre back seam. So step 3, we're going to be joining the one shoulder seam together. So this is the same for both views A, B, C and D, both bodice views. So if we get the right sides together, both right sides facing, and then just join up one side seam.
one shoulder seam, sorry. So it doesn't matter which shoulder seam you sew up, just as long as it's only one of them. So again, with our 1 centimeter seam allowance, back tacking at the beginning and the end. We've got one shoulder done. So now what we're going to do is finish our seam, whether that be with zigzag or overlocking stitch, and then iron it outwards. So normally when we iron your shoulder seams, you iron the kind of excess seam allowance fabric, you iron it towards the back of the garment, so it's going towards the back of your shoulder. Step 4 is making your binding. So if you're making your own binding rather than using store-bought binding, this is how you do it. Though if you're using store-bought binding, you can skip over this step because it will already be all done for you. So with your binding piece, I've kind of done one here already. So you would have cut these out on the bias, which is the 45-degree angle to the fabric, to the way the grain is. That means it just will sit nicely when it's around your neck. It's not going to pucker up or anything. So we take the binding piece, and then what I've already done with this one is I've ironed it. So you've got your flat piece here, and then I've ironed it in 1 centimeter on either side, and then ironed it in half. So as you can see, it's got 3 folds. So the 1st centimeter on one side, the 2nd centimeter, and then over in half. So that's what it looks like. So this next step, which is attaching the binding to the neckline, is the same on both views A, B, C, and D. So they'll all have some neckline binding on them. So we start by sewing on the right side of the fabric. So we've got the center seam in our back piece, we've got our one shoulder attached, and then as you can see, it's been ironed down to face the back of the garment. You just pop a pin in there to make sure that it doesn't flip over or fold over whilst you're sewing. And then we've got our bias binding. So if we start on the right side of our fabric, and we start at one of the open shoulder seams. So you can kind of hang it off the end a little bit there, it doesn't need to be right on the edge. And then we unfold that first seam. It's always good to pop a pin in the first bit. You can pin all the way around with your binding, but you also don't have to. You can kind of just position it as you go. Depends how confident you are, but you can totally take the time to pin it all the way around. So we want this first raw edge lining up with the edge of the neckline. And so we want right side to right side. So the right side of your bias binding should be facing the right side of your bodice piece. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to stitch in that first crease all the way around the neckline, all the way to the other end. So you just go nice and slow and steady in this step. You've got all the time in the world. So just making sure to back tack at the beginning and at the end. And then just gently move it around the curve of the neckline. And then when you're going over the shoulder seam, just as we've popped the pin in there, just make sure that it's keeping that seam facing towards the back of your shoulder. So just trim it off at the end. You'll always have a little bit of excess binding, especially if you're making it yourself. We've added a little bit extra into the pattern. So if you just trim off the end with a little bit hanging over, these little scrap bits of binding are always really good to make little ties for drawstring bags or anything. I've got a big box that I save of any leftover bias binding, and they do come in handy, so don't throw that one away. So now that we've got it attached all the way around our kind of front piece and our back piece, we're now going to fold it over. So what you can do is we fold back that first seam, so we flip it over, and then you fold the bias binding over your raw edge and fold it onto the inside. So this side, I do like to put a few pins in place just to keep it all together. So what you're doing is you're encasing those raw edges into the binding. You've got the binding on the inside of your garment now, and on the outside you don't see it. So you'll just see the stitch line around the top. So with this one, you can, once you've got it pinned down, you can give it a good iron as well to make sure it stays in place, or you can give it an iron after you've sewn it. But would highly recommend pinning in place. Because we've cut it on the bias, it means that when it's going around the curve of the neckline, it's not going to pucker or crease. It's got a little bit more stretch, so it will just blend with it. So now we've got our bias binding pinned all the way around. So as you can see, on the inside and then on the outside, you don't see any of the bias binding. So it's all been folded over to be kind of hidden on the inside of the collar. So now what we're going to do is just stitch all the way around, and you want to stitch as close to the edge of the bias binding as possible, making sure you don't go too close that you fall off the edge. Again, always starting and finishing with a back tack. This means that your garments won't come undone. So there we have it. So our bias binding has now been attached onto our neckline. You can see from the wrong side, the outside, the right side, sorry, you've just got the one stitch line all the way along, and then on the inside is where the bias binding is. So it means that it's not going to fray when you pop it in the wash, and it's just a nice, clean, simple finish all the way around. So our next step is to close the second shoulder seam. So trim off any little excess binding, any excess threads, and we want to line up binding right on the edge there. Pop in a pin in the rest of the shoulder seam. So this is the same for both views A and B and C and D. All of them. And again, just like we sewed the first shoulder seam, just the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Give it an overlock or a zigzag if that's how you're finishing off your seams, and then press it towards the back. Now that we've got this second shoulder seam done, and I've just kind of ironed it and push the seam allowance towards the back, just to keep this the little seam that we've done down, you can just add in a little back tack just along the shoulder seam here. You won't be able to see it once you're wearing it, and it'll just mean it'll keep it down and keep it from flapping around. Once we do it with our armhole seams, that'll be caught in the side seam, so we won't have that issue there. And just trim off any threads you have. I find that if I trim threads as I go, I'm less likely to have a whole bunch of threads at the end when I'm wearing it out in public. Number 1 tip. So here we have got the binding done, the back seam done, and your 2 shoulder seams. So if you're doing the dress A or B, but just got the sleeves, you can now skip the next step. The next step is just going to show you how to do the binding on the armholes for views C and D. So you can watch along so you know how to do it for next time, or just skip this one for now, and your next step will be after this will be how to attach the sleeves. So step 8, which is attaching the binding to your armholes. So it is the exact same way as how we've attached it to our neckline. So starting on the outside, the right side of your fabric, open it up just like we did with the neckline, and start here and work all the way around down to the end of the other shoulder seam. So open up your binding, place raw edge to raw edge, right side to right side, pop a pin in, and then as you did with the neckline, sew all the way around. Just make sure everything is sitting nice and flush when you wear it. So again, you can cut off any of the excess binding you have and pop that aside for another project. I find it really good when making little drawstring bags for Christmas or birthday presents, and you can just use the binding as the drawstring. You don't have to make any, which makes it super quick, and your future self will love you for having excess binding. It's never a bad thing. So again, we're just going to fold this binding over on itself onto the inside, stitch all the way along, popping in a few pins as we go just to make sure that it stays down. So now that we've got our armhole binding all pinned into place, we're just going to stitch along that along the small edge, right along the edge there. So now one armhole is done, we're now going to pop over and do the second armhole. So exactly the same way we did the neckline binding and the first armhole binding. Now do the second. Pop a pin in, preferably not wonky. So raw edge to raw edge, right side to right side, and stitch away, stitching in that first crease line. We fold over the binding, encapsulating those raw edges, and fold it down to the inside, pinning all the way along. Sometimes this can feel like the most tedious part of the project, and it probably is the most fiddly, long-winded part. So once you're done with this, smooth sailing. We're just going to stitch along like the other two. So now we've got the binding on the neckline and on the two armholes. So now we're on to step 9, which is attaching the sleeves onto bodice view A and B. So we've got our binding on our neckline, we've got our 2 shoulder seams done, and we've got our back center seam with the stitching. So what we want to do is lay out flat and then get one of your sleeve pieces, and so it's the curved edge that we want to round around the sleeve armhole. So what I like to do is fold the sleeve in half and just make sure you make a mark, pop a little pin in where your center mark is. And then with this center mark, we line it up with our shoulder seam. Again, just popping in a little pin to make sure that the shoulder seams are facing towards the back of the garment. And we want right side to right side. It's a little bit tricky to see here because I'm using a white linen and it's all kind of the same. But when you're using a printed fabric or something that's a bit more on one side, you'll definitely be able to notice that. What's the wrong side, what's the right side? So if you pop a pin in the middle, and then I work my way around, just popping a couple of pins in here and there, just to make sure that it's all lining up and in place before we sew it through. So you're kind of manipulating the curve to go around your sleeve. It may look a little bit strange when you've got it laid out flat. It doesn't look like it really goes together because they're curved different ways. But it'll all make sense once you've sewn this seam and flipped it around the other way. So now that we've got our sleeve pinned on, so the right side of the fabric to the right side, and you're pinning on the wrong side of your fabric, then you sew a seam allowance, again like with everything else we do, just a 1 centimeter seam allowance from the edge all the way around, back tacking at the beginning and at the end. Now that we've got the sleeve attached, you can then overlock or zigzag your finish and then iron it outwards. So now that second shoulder sleeve seam is sewn, I'm just going to give it an overlock and press it out. So we want, when we're pressing it from the outside, we want to press it so that the seam allowance is towards the sleeve and away from the bodice.
So now we're showing you how to join the bodice for views C and D. Just make sure you trim off any excess binding. And again, so we've got the binding that goes around from the shoulder onto the arm. And because that seam is already all finished off, what we do is line up your two binding pieces and just sew down here, down through your bodice. So pop a few pins in place. It's always best to start up at your binding and get it right on the edge there. Just put that end right underneath your presser foot. And then stitch all the way down to close off to your hem. So a very easy little stitch for this view. And the same for your other side as well. So now we are going to join the two bodices together through the sleeve. So this view is for view A and B, and next up I'll show you view C and D. So we've got right sides together, and this is our sleeve. So make sure that now that we've overlocked and we've ironed and we've popped it towards the sleeve and away from the bodice, we want to line up these two seams at our underarm and pop a pin in place. So then pop some pins in. So this is your sleeve piece here. And then down through your bodice along here. So you're going to do the same for both sides, and then just sew a 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way down, pivoting at the underarm here and then down the side of the bodice. So for view A and B with the sleeves, now we're just going to hem the sleeves. So we've attached them through the bodice. The top is basically all complete. What I've done is I've overlocked my sleeve edges just because I'm using linen and it frays a little bit. We are doing a double fold under those, so you don't need to overlock them. I'm just going to fold it inside out and then do a double 1 centimeter fold. Once, fold it twice, pop pin. The beauty with linen is that you can kind of press these seams with your fingers a little bit and they seem to stay down. It's a very forgiving fabric to sew with. But if you're using a different fabric, you can always give it an iron at this stage as well to make sure that those hems stay up. And then the same for the other side. And then all we're going to do is stitch around these right close to the edge, kind of like we did with the binding, right along the edge there, all the way around, and then our sleeves will be nicely finished. So we are now up to step 12, which is attaching our pockets. So you do the same for both the front and back pieces of the skirt before we join them together. So you get your short side, so along here is the top of the skirt where we're going to gather, and then this is where we're going to be popping the pocket piece. So you measure down 2.5 centimeters from the top. Just pop a little pin mark in there. And then we are going to attach the pocket facing inwards. So with your pocket piece here, what I've done is I've already overlocked, or you can zigzag stitch around the pocket bag just to finish it off, because it does get a little bit tricky to do this once it's already attached onto your skirt. So just lining that top up with the 2.5 centimeter mark from the top. Just going to pop a couple of pins in here. So you do the same with the other side as well as the other piece, your back piece. So what we're going to do now is just sew a 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way down the side and then iron it facing outwards, so pushing outwards that way. Just give it a nice crisp iron finish there.
So just sewing a 1 centimetre seam allowance, back tacking at the beginning and the end. And then once we've sewn all 4 pockets on, we're going to take it over to the iron and give it a good press out. So now we're up to step 13, which is attaching the front and back skirt pieces together. So what I've done is, after I've attached on the pocket bag, given it a good press, I've also just finished this side seam down here. So I've just overlocked mine, but you can also zigzag it as we discuss. This just gives a nice finish. It's a little bit tricky to do once you've got the two together because you're kind of going around the pocket bag. So it's always good to do it beforehand, especially if you're using linen, because it can fray a lot. So on the table, I've got my skirt piece with the right side facing up. I grab the back piece and pop it on, so it's the exact same as the front, so we're just joining it together to be a big loop. So we just pop it on with right sides together. We want to get that seam, these two seams lining up. Just pop a few pins in to keep it in place. It's always a good idea to close off the pocket bag with pins, just so it doesn't slip around while you're sewing it. So what we're going to do is sew a 1 cm seam allowance down your 2.5 centimeters, pivot, and then go all the way around the pocket bag, all the way back to the base of the pocket bag, pivot again, and then continue down just to join the two front and back pieces together. So we do the same for both sides, and it'll form one giant loop, which we will then gather in the next step. So you're almost there. If you've stayed along this far, you're getting towards the end. So do the same for the other side, and then sew your 1 centimeter seam allowance. So when doing the gathering stitches, you don't need to back tack at the beginning or the end. We want to keep these loose as we'll be pulling them through afterwards. So make sure you've got a fair amount at the beginning as well. So as you can see, we've got our 2 rows of stitching there. Nice loose stitches is gathering your stitches. So what you want to do is grab the bodice that you're using. For this one, I'm going to do bodices A and B with the sleeves. So we lay that out so that we get the size of what we need to gather our stitches to. So it's the base size that we're working with. Then we get our skirt that we've just sewn all the stitching lines on. We grab 2 of the threads from the first line and the second line. We gently start to gather that. So that the gathering is the same length as the skirt bodice. So as you can see there, it's just already starting to gather. Just slow and steady with this one. You don't want to pull it too tight so that you snap any of the cords, of the threads. If you have a gathering foot for your machine, you can also use this here. So I like to divide my gathers in half, so I'll do the front side and then the back side using the beginning of the threads and then the end of the threads. Just that way you're not pulling it all the way around, which can get a little bit tricky, a little bit stiff sometimes. Matches the front bodice. Now we'll work on gathering the other side. Grab
overlapping the two threads from where we ended the stitching lines. So now the next step is we're going to pin the bodice and the skirt together. So this means we're kind of almost at the end of our skirt. So we want to pin it together, right sides to right sides. The best way to do this is to turn your skirt inside out. You've got your pockets on the outside, and then pop your skirt bodice, so that's right way out, and pop it inside your skirt. We're then going to start by pinning the side seams of your bodice to the side seams of your skirt. It's always the best way to start. Making sure your gathers are nice and even all the way along. So there we've got the skirt and the bodice to pin together. So the skirt's on the outside and the bodice is inside. So we've got the right sides together so that when it's all sewn, it'll be the right way around. And then we just make sure that we turn our machine setting back to our standard stitch size. And then sew all the way around with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, making sure that we cover those two gathering stitches that we did. If any of the gathering stitches do end up showing on the other side of the dress, we can easily just unpick those. So now that we've attached that, we can turn it the right way out. And there we have it. Our skirt is attached to our top and our dress is almost complete. So now we want to turn it back inside out, finish that off with either your overlocker or your zigzag stitch, and give it a good press down so that it all sits flat. And then we'll go on to hemming our dress, the very last step that we've got. So now we've got the bodice, which is attached to the skirt, got our pockets. So yeah, all we've got left to do is fold up our hem. So we're doing a double 1 centimeter fold. So making sure that your side seams are all pressed the one way. Fold 1 centimeter, fold another centimeter, and pop a pin in place. Then we're going to be stitching just a top stitch all the way along that line there, all the way around. So easy peasy, you're on the home stretch, very last thing to do. And there we have our hem complete. So now that we have completed our dress, we've done all the hemming, we like to add some special little tags to the end as a finishing little touch. What we're going to use today is some of the Kylie and the Machine tags. So we're going to use these little secret pajama ones. Super cute. This dress is so comfortable, especially working from home at the moment. Feels like you're not even wearing clothes, but you are. Also great for going out for dinner if you want to eat a lot of food. It's so floaty, you can't even tell. So I'm going to attach this secret pajamas little tag here. I'm just going to attach it to the back. So it already comes pre-folded. Just going to pop it in place with a pin. Just do a few little stitches on either side. You can hand stitch this in also.
totally up to you. So I'm going to stick that one at the back of the dress on the inside. They're also super cute, you can pop them on the outside, they're so well designed. And then I've also got this little look after me tag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this one in a side seam. So I've got my pocket here, pop it in underneath there. And again, just go over it with my machine on a straight stitch. The great thing about sewing in care labels and any type of label is when you've finished with your end of life of the garment, and if you take it to an op shop, second-hand store, try and resell it, a lot of these places, if they don't have a tag in them, they just throw them straight in the bin. They could be the most beautiful, handcrafted, so much time and care spent into it compared to that top you got from H&M, but if it doesn't have a tag in, they will just put it straight in the bin. So it's great to have these little tags to pop in. It means that you're just giving them a little bit of a future life as well after you finish with them. So there's our little care tag in the side seam. Just trim off all the little threads. And there we've got our little tag, secret pajamas in the back. So I just like to note that this is not a sponsor at all, we just love these tags so much. They're great to finish off your garment. So here we have bodices C and D. So this was one of the examples that I went through today, but obviously we didn't attach it to the skirt. What you can also do is just do a 2cm hem on the bottom, a similar one that we did for the end of the skirt. And here you have a nice little crop top. You can do the same with use A and B as well with the sleeves. We've got our armhole binding, our neck binding, and our centre back seam detail. So perfect to go with denim shorts, jeans, skirts, you name it. It's a great little top. It's a very versatile pattern. So as you can see, we've got the finalised fawn dress here. So this is view A with the short length, but all these steps that we've shown today are exactly the same for views B and D, which is the long length. The skirt's just ultimately longer. So we've got a nice gathered bodice, pockets on the side, centre back seam, all of our neck binding and sleeves. Perfect for lounging at home, perfect for going out for dinner, eating a little too much. Just your very easy beginner sewing pattern.